Well, hello, and welcome to Session 5 of a Panorama of the Christian Church. We're going to talk about what God has been doing really in the last couple of hundred years in this, what I believe to be a very interesting course on church history. This is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about in this session. I hope you are too. So let's get started. As always, we are talking about how God has been fulfilling his promises over the last couple of thousand years. Specific promises that he made to his church and his people. So we're going to be looking at that for the last couple of hundred years and how God's been doing that. We've been asking ourselves the question, why in the world should we look backward? Why not just look for the present or look forward? But the answer to that is that we must learn the lessons of the past, the positive things that the church has learned as it's followed Christ and the things that it's done in making mistakes. We need to learn from all of those things. And we often fail to see how God's fulfilling his promises in the present because we don't know how God has fulfilled them in the past. So we don't really know what to look for sometimes. And then churches of all kinds need perspective today. We just need to know that we're part of something much bigger. So we're going to be looking at that. By way of review, let's talk about what God's been doing in the particular sessions that we've been looking at. Between 33 and 313 AD, God was establishing his church just as he promised. He was getting them firmly founded on the foundation of the apostles and prophets and all that had gone on before, I should say. Between 313 and 800 AD, he was building his church. He was getting it stronger. The church had been legalized in the Roman Empire, and it was getting stronger and more organized. And actually, it was the thing that held what was left of Rome together when the barbarians invaded the western part of the Roman Empire and pretty much brought it down. Between 800 and 1500, he was strengthening his church. He was expanding it, growing it, deepening it. But at the same time, the church was making mistakes and getting, in some ways, further away from the original calling it had received. And then between 1500 and 1700, he was correcting his church. He was reforming his church. He promised he would do that if we needed correction, and he was true to his word. He did. Let's look at some maps. The orange areas are the Christian influence by 200 AD. We've talked about this before. By 400 AD, the Roman Empire was pretty thoroughly Christianized. Not everybody was a Christian, certainly, but it was well known what Christianity was. By 800 AD, we had lost some ground to Islam. All of North Africa, most of the Middle East, and a good deal of Spain and Portugal was lost to Muslim expansion, but Christianity had expanded into Germany and England by that time as well. Now look at the map around 1000 AD. Christianity has pushed way into Northern and Eastern Europe and is beginning to push Islam south in Spain and Portugal. By 1492, the year of Columbus's voyage, you see that Christianity is split east and west. The green is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The orange is Roman Catholicism. And Spain and Portugal have been completely reclaimed for Catholicism. Then after the Reformation, you see the different Protestant groups represented. The blue areas, the deep blue areas are Lutherans in Scandinavia and in Germany and parts of Central Europe. You've got Anglicanism in the red in England. The yellow spots are the Reformed churches, which would be Presbyterianism in Scotland, but the Huguenot in France, the Dutch Reformed and German Reformed in the Netherlands and Germany, respectively. And then, of course, the Mennonites, the Anabaptists, are the Great Triangles, which were driven basically out of Western Europe. Some came to America, and some were invited to settle in Russia by Catherine the Great. We talked about the four main branches of the Protestant Reformation, which would be Lutheranism, the Reformed churches, Anglicanism, and the Radicals. We did mention the Moravian Brethren, which were sort of a proto-Protestant group that went underground. They were never officially recognized, never really free to practice what they believed until after the other churches were settled in the Reformation. Now let's talk about the Church and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment period lasted from about 1700 Roughly to about 1850, but the outworkings of the Enlightenment are still with us in the 21st century, and we'll find that out very quickly. All right, let's get started. So what was God doing during this time? Well, I think he was refocusing his church just as he promised he would do. Hebrews 2, verses 1 through 3 says, "We must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we've heard, so that we do not drift away." That's the key phrase. "For if the message spoken by angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation?" Ignore such a great salvation. That is what the Enlightenment invited people to do and is still inviting people to do, to ignore the Christian message of salvation. So what was the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment was a movement to replace Christianity with human reason and the scientific method. So human reason and scientific method would replace the Bible as the authority and as the foundations of society. Enlightenment thinkers saw religion as a dangerous superstition. It wasn't just something to be ignored, it was something to be opposed. Many Enlightenment thinkers favored something like deism. They admitted that a God must exist, but they didn't believe that God was involved with the world at all these days. So deism believes in a remote creator God who's no longer involved. Why did they think this way? Well, many Enlightenment leaders were troubled by the religious wars of the 1500s and 1600s. They saw Lutherans and Catholics fighting each other. They saw the Catholic Church fighting the Reformed churches. They saw everybody beating up on the Mennonites. They saw what happened in England with the whole Anglican upheaval. And people lost their lives in many ways. People were displaced from their homelands. And they saw that as, well, the religion must be the problem then. If we just got rid of religion, then maybe things would be better. If we could just be reasonable people, just use our heads, common sense, reason with one another, and got rid of religion, then the world would be a better place. That's what they were thinking. They were, of course, critical of organized religion, but especially of Roman Catholicism. But they didn't neglect the Protestants. They didn't like them either. The Enlightenment thinkers played down literal interpretations of the Bible. They questioned its historical truth, and they devalued the role of clergy. So the clergy were minimized, pushed off to the side. Scientists and other scholars who were not religious were celebrated in many cases. Enlightenment thinkers went so far as to believe that human nature could be changed and improved through expert-guided training and better living conditions. And I think we're seeing that today. We're living in a culture where we're told to believe the experts. Of course, nobody tells us who got to choose that they were experts, who got to say that those people were experts. But we're told to do that, and that those experts would help us live a better life. And, we see the fruits of the Enlightenment. There have been some real positive things happen from the Enlightenment. Science has made great advances. But in many ways, people are still people, and the Enlightenment has taken the wonder out of life in many ways, and it's taken hope out of life in many ways. The practical tools that the Enlightenment thinkers were offering were things like education, science, and a new type of government, that if we just got rid of the old kind of government and brought in some new government, that would be the answer to it all. What were the results of the Enlightenment? Well, the secular worldview that we live by, where God is not a part of society at all, and in fact, if you talk about God too much in the wrong company, then you'll be told to be quiet, you'll be mocked, because God doesn't exist and he's irrelevant, and only the experts can tell us what's true. The Enlightenment values science as the answer to all questions. Of course, science can only talk about things it can measure and observe. By definition, God can't be measured or observed, and neither can the supernatural. So science says there is no supernatural, but it can't say that because it has no way of measuring or observing something that is not in the material world. The Enlightenment devalues organized religion, and it seeks radical social change through politics, and sometimes very aggressive and ruthless politics. Well, now let's talk about how the church reacted to the Enlightenment. We've seen what the Enlightenment was. We've even recognized that we're still dealing with some aspects of it today, but how has the church reacted to that? The church obviously was aware of it and had to do something in a society that was becoming more and more influenced by the Enlightenment? Well, for one thing, it was pietism. The church decided to get serious about personal holiness and righteous living, especially in Protestant churches, and especially the Lutheran churches of Germany. Pietism focused on spiritual disciplines and personal holiness. They felt that the Lutheran church had gotten way too formal and dry, and that within that church people should be concentrating on living authentic Christian lives. Another movement was revivalism, and there were various waves of revival in Europe and America that promoted evangelism. People came to know the Lord, personal conversion, and church renewal. Then there was the big explosion of missions, the beginnings of missions around the world. Catholics had been doing that already, but Protestant missions were launched during this time. And then there were all sorts of experimental things that happened, including things that spun off of authentic Christianity, historic Christianity, things that Christians would call cults, but that other people would call alternative Christianities. And we'll look at some of those. So let's talk about pietism. Pietism was attributed to Pastor Philip Spener. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany. He believed that the Lutheran church, had become too formal and really didn't take personal holiness seriously enough, and he felt that that was a terrible thing, that people were just going through the motions. So he founded pietist groups, people that were concentrating on their own piety, meaning their own holiness, their own righteous living. And they practiced Bible study, personal Bible study, which was now possible because you had the printing press, and it was printing out Bibles, and people could memorize it. Maybe the group could have a copy. Personal Bibles were still pretty rare in those days, but still a church might have a copy, and groups might gather to study it. And of course they prayed, they cared for each other, they encouraged each other to live righteous lives. And within Lutheran pietism, they influenced many other groups in other Protestant movements. Pietism combined with an interesting group of people. These were the Moravian Brethren we talked about in the last session. The Moravian Brethren had been underground in Bohemia, which was the Czech Republic, and surrounding areas. For maybe 250 years, they'd been underground. They were surviving very quietly. And then once the Protestant Reformation got settled and was well on its feet, they felt confident enough to migrate out of Bohemia and into what would now be Eastern Germany and settle at a community that they founded called Herrnhut. It was on the land of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. He was very sympathetic to their movement. And so this merged pietistic Lutherans with the Moravian Hussites to form a very powerful movement, the pietistic communalist movement. Moravians were key to the beginnings of modern missions. They were the ones who came up with the vision that Protestants needed to go reach people for Jesus. Not just reach people from other churches, but also to reach people who'd never heard. And so they began with groups like the Eskimos, or the Inuit, now they're called, Native Americans, and Caribbean slaves. We mentioned revivalism. There were several waves of revival during this time. So isn't it interesting that at the very same time that the Enlightenment was spreading and that people were being encouraged to ignore Christianity, walk away from Christianity, that there was nothing to it, at the very same time there were these great movements of mass conversions. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. It all began in the mid-1730s. With mass Christian awakenings in mainly Britain and in the American colonies, but it spread to other places as well. Some of the prominent preachers were the British preacher George Whitefield. He was an Anglican clergyman, but he preached a very evangelistic, revivalistic message. He didn't take for granted that people were Christians simply because they were baptized into the Anglican Church as babies. He wanted to see people make personal steps of faith. And so as a result, he was often banned from Anglican pulpits, although sometimes he was allowed to preach in some churches. And in fact, he even preached before the King of England at one point, and the King of England was very, very impressed with him. He had an amazing carrying voice. And you have to remember that in those days, There were no microphones. There was no sound system. So if you were going to preach to thousands of people at one time, you had to have a great oratorical voice that could carry long distances, and your pronunciation had to be perfect so that people could hear what you were saying. They say that George Whitefield preached to over 12,000 people sometimes, who would gather along hillsides and, wherever he would find a place that would hold that many people. And many, many people were saved. The Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley. Charles wrote the music. John preached the sermons. John Wesley was a great orator as well. He preached to thousands and thousands of people. There's a story that he was preaching as an Anglican clergyman. He was banned also from Anglican pulpits. So he would set up at a crossroads, and they'd build a little pulpit, and they'd stand there, and they'd preach to people passing by. And one time somebody got really mad and threw a rock aimed at him, and he ducked, and it actually hit somebody behind him and killed him. So Wesley jumped off the platform. There was a nearby lake. He jumped into the lake and swam to an island and continued to preach. Really remarkable. Wesley would go to wherever there were numbers of people gathering. For example, in Wales, he would show up at the big coal mines, and he'd wait for the shift change. He'd wait for the miners to come up out of the pit, and the next group of miners to go down into the pit. And oftentimes they would laugh at him and scorn him and mock him and jeer him. And of course the miners with their coal dust all over their face. But the stories are told that after a few minutes of Wesley preaching, those who remained and who didn't wander off, you could begin to see the little white trails of tears running down their cheeks as the tears washed away the coal dust from their face. And many, many people were saved. Both Whitefield and Wesley made tours of the American colonies, and again, many, many people were saved and churches were founded. A homegrown American preacher was Jonathan Edwards. He was from Northampton, Massachusetts. He was also convinced that the church was dry and formal and mostly dead. And they wept and they wailed and they covered their ears and they begged him to stop, but they made decisions to follow Christ. And instead of the church decreasing, the church became packed. In fact, new churches had to be started, and this revival between the Whitefield preaching, the Wesleys, and Jonathan Edwards, and a number of others, the revivalist movement spread all across the American colonies, all up and down Great Britain, and it spread to many other places as well. First Great Awakening, very much centered around great preachers, centered around evangelism asking and trying to persuade people to make a decision, a conscious decision for Christ. Now remember, this is the Enlightenment. They're talking about think about it and make a rational decision for Jesus Christ. They're in the environment of the Enlightenment, but they're harnessing this whole idea of using logic and rational thinking to apply it to faith in Christ. Not so the Second Great Awakening, 1800, 1850. Second Great Awakening is far more emphasis on emotion. New groups formed during this time, especially on the American frontier. There were some revivalist groups in the eastern cities, and this is mainly an American phenomenon, not so much in Britain and the other countries. Mainly in the American continent, some great preachers in the cities, but a lot of it happens out on the frontier, because in the frontier, you can do things and there isn't anybody to stop you. There's no established church to object. There's no law enforcement to come and break anything up. And so this began in the year 1800, summer of 1800 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. But it began to spread all up and down the frontier. And instead of asking people to think and make a rational choice for Christ, it was all about emotions and getting people stirred up and afraid of going to hell and all excited about the Holy Spirit coming. It wasn't Pentecostalism yet. Pentecostalism didn't happen for a number of decades yet. But it was sort of like the beginnings of what would become Pentecostalism in many ways. You can see in this picture there's a lot of swooning and fainting and people being overcome with emotion. And these fiery preachers that really went into a lot of theatrics, supposedly. And many new groups were formed during this time, some of which were standard, historic Christian churches that believed the same things. They just were all about converting people. And some decided to go outside the boundaries of historic Christianity and become what many people would call a cult. So here's some of the great preachers. Charles Finney was a great Presbyterian pastor on the East Coast and in the large cities. He was the great preacher of the time, the golden-tongued preacher. Timothy Dwight was a great preacher. He was at Yale College. I believe he was president of Yale College. Barton Stone was the founder of the Cane Ridge Revivals starting in 1800. And he was maybe the leader in that, but many others joined him. Alexander Campbell and his son founded the Churches of Christ. We'll talk about them a little bit later. Richard Allen was in the Episcopal Church, but he was told that he and other blacks could not take communion with the whites, and so they left the church and founded the African Methodist Episcopal, the AME, which was the first black denomination in the United States. Also very evangelistic, especially among black folks. And then William Miller was the founder of Adventism. We'll also talk about them a little bit later. Then there was the Great Missions Movement. The Great Missions Movement was spurred by the continuing discovery and exploration of new lands, along with evangelizing slaves and native peoples, as well as settlers on the frontier. The first Protestant missionaries were sent to the far corners of the world, places like China and Burma and Africa. Some examples: David Brainerd, who went to the Delaware tribe, and there are many others who sought out other Native American tribes, and William Carey, who was the pioneer in India, not only bringing the gospel to India, but founding schools, hospitals, and all sorts of social reform movements and organizations that really transformed Indian life and Indian culture even to this very day. There's William Carey. He was a cobbler. Since he was not an Anglican, even though he was very intellectual, if you weren't Anglican, you couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. So he was barred from education, and so he educated himself. He learned Hebrew and Greek, as well as other languages. He studied the Bible, he studied theology, and he ended up praying for India and going to India in 1793. He's quoted by saying, "Expect great things from God and attempt great things for God." And again, as I said, he was the beginning of the transformation of Indian society. Now remember, India was not a country when Carey went there. It was a whole bunch of little kingdoms and districts governed by different people, often at war with each other. They practiced the burning of widows. They practiced, the caste system and in effect enslaving the lower castes. There was no education because in many cases the languages were not written. Now Sanskrit had been written, but many of the local languages were not written. So Carey and the others devised alphabets and scripts for these Indian languages, enabling them to read. And what were they going to read? Well, they read the Bible and Christian literature. Of course, later there were other pieces of literature and writings in these languages, but the Bible led the way. And so Carey was responsible for shutting down many of these practices that we would look down on, like infanticide and widow burning and many of these other things. And many people came to Christ, and India has a very sizable Christian population to this day. It's not the majority by any means, but it certainly is a sizable group. Johann Dober and David Nishman were Moravian missionaries from this Herrnhut settlement, Herrnhut movement, and they decided that they needed to go and save the slaves who were making sugar cane in the Caribbean. They were in Denmark, and they decided that they would go there, but the Danish government said, "No, we don't want you messing with them. We want the slaves to be happy doing what they're doing. We don't want them to become dissatisfied and have some kind of ambition for doing greater things. So no, we're not going to let you go." Well, they managed to persuade a captain of a ship to take them there, and they began work among the slaves in 1732, and they've started many churches, a great revival among the slaves, and the churches remain to this very day in the Caribbean. As I mentioned, David Brainerd went to the Delaware tribe to bring the gospel to them, as well as many others to other tribes. And I believe the first Bible printed on American soil was not English. It was probably the Delaware Bible that Brainerd spent years translating into their language. Adoniram Judson was an American who got his friends together and said, let's pool our resources and send me to Burma, which is now Myanmar. He went in 1813 and was the first, I guess you'd say, American who went overseas to Asia as a missionary and began really the American missions movement, which is robust to this very day. So by 1850, you can see that not only was Europe heavily Christianized, but parts of Africa, little segments of India, the edges of South America and North America, as well as the colonies of Australia and New Zealand, which were crown colonies at that time. Then there were the experimental movements, or some might call them alternative Christianities. So this nearly complete freedom on the American frontier was an ideal laboratory for religious experimentation. And probably the movement that experimented the most was something called Restorationism. Restorationism believed that Christianity had died out soon after the last of the apostles was gone, and that there hadn't been any real true church on earth for hundreds and hundreds of years, not since the 1st or 2nd century. And so that everything in the Middle Ages was apostate. There may have been a few Christians here and there, but for the most part, Christianity had died out on earth, and it had to be restarted. And here's the kicker, it had to be restarted by their leader. Their leader claimed that they had been personally called by God to do that. It was mainly an American phenomenon, mainly in the United States. And so these different people believed that God was calling them to restore the church that had not existed for years and years and years. For example, Joseph Smith Jr. of the Latter-day Saints, he believed that God had given him a vision, calling him to restart the true church. But his doctrine is very different from historic Christianity. A very different concept of who God is, who Jesus is, different concept of how you're saved. Obviously, there's other books that supersede the Bible. The Bible's only accurate as it agrees with their later books, the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, Doctrine and Covenants. And so Joseph Smith was the new prophet who was called to restart the church, and that's what many people believed. And of course, the Mormons were kicked around from one place to another. Sometimes they got themselves in trouble. Sometimes they just had a bad rep. They ended up going to Utah after Joseph Smith was killed under the leadership of Brigham Young, where they had complete freedom. There was nobody out there. And so they had complete freedom to get established. They also sent missionaries back to Europe and converted a lot of people and brought them over. Mary Baker Eddy was back east, back in Massachusetts. She believed she heard voices from God and that she was given a book that would reinterpret the New Testament the correct way. So the New Testament's kind of a book in code as far as she was concerned, and that she had the code book that would unlock the mysteries. It was very much a Gnostic kind of religion. Gnosticism was a problem in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. And they basically said that Jesus was only a man and that Christ was a spirit that inhabited that man while he was on the earth. And that material things were not real, that only the spiritual world was real, material world was an illusion. And that's what she also taught. That Jesus was the human being that was inhabited by the Christ spirit, and that the material world is unreal, and that your mind is what is real. Of course, there again, power of the mind, willpower, coming out of the Enlightenment. Charles Taze Russell came along a little bit later. He's about a generation after Joseph Smith. He founds the Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1870s. He made several predictions that Jesus would come back before 1900, and then made a big announcement that Jesus was coming back in 1914. The witnesses thought that World War I was the signal of that because it started in 1914, but obviously he didn't physically return, so Russell said that Jesus returned invisibly. His doctrine was also very different. Jesus is not God. He's the Archangel Michael. There's no Trinity. You're saved through doing the works of Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. So these and many other groups were newly formed on the American frontier in this experimentation. Also, groups like Unitarianism formed in New England, which basically is not Christian. It just believes in God and says that all religions are saying the same thing. Utopianism was a movement also on the American frontier, the Amana movement in Iowa, but especially the Shakers throughout places like Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. The Shakers were all about living in community, living simply, and the brotherhood and sisterhood of the believers. I don't think that they were terribly orthodox in their Christianity. I think they kind of also experimented with their own beliefs. Adventism managed to stay within the bounds of historic Christianity, but they had some very unique views about Jesus coming back. Charles Russell of the Jehovah's Witnesses, had originally studied under Adventists, so he was kind of used to the idea of predicting Jesus would return. But the Adventists had predicted that Jesus would return in 1844, which he didn't, and then 1845, which he didn't, causing the great Adventist disillusion. And the Adventist movement basically dissipated, except for a core group that combined the Adventism, the coming of Jesus, with the Sabbath keeping and the kosher laws. And then we call those Seventh-day Adventists under Ellen G. White. Also, early forms of modernism or liberal churches formed within denominations. So you had conservative Methodists and liberal Methodists who were very much all about discounting the Bible and being up with the times and the values of the times. Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans. So there were these liberal or modernist wings within established denominational groups. So what was God doing during this time? Well, he was refocusing his church. Hebrews 2:1-3 says, if you get off track, I will revive you. I will send people to wake you up. Don't drift away. Don't drift into the Enlightenment. Don't ignore such a great salvation. Remember the foundations of your faith and stick with that, because that is the only place where there is hope and truth and righteousness and goodness. What about some applications? Well, let's apply these things. I think the Pietists and the Communalists were right. We need personal growth. It's not enough to just go to church or be a member of a church. You have to focus on your own growth in Christ. You have to focus on repenting of sin and living a righteous life. Of course we make mistakes. Of course we never become perfect. But we progress in our maturity, in our wisdom, in our faith, and in our holiness. Community is vital. We need other believers. We can't just go to church and do our thing and then live our lives. You need other believers to encourage you and be strong where you're weak, and for you to be strong when they're weak. The revivalists were on target. We've got to be born again. We must be. There's no other way to do it. You can't be baptized and be a Christian. Baptism is a sign of salvation. It's not the cause of salvation. It's not the means of salvation. And so the revivalists were right. We need to spread the word. Even today, we're living in a post-Christian society that was largely post-Christian because it embraced the Enlightenment long ago. And so we need people to wake up and find salvation and true life, because there really isn't life. The experts can't give you life. The having a job and money doesn't give you life. Only Christ gives life. The mission pioneers were examples of our mandate to reach the whole world. We owe people in the far reaches of the world the gospel. Why? Because somebody gave it to us. Somebody gave it to us, and somebody gave it to our ancestors. Those of us of European or African background, we were lost until somebody from the Middle East brought the gospel to us. And now we need to bring the gospel to others who've never heard it in the deepest parts of the world, the most remote parts of the world. And that's happening. I have a friend who's actually working with the emerging church in Mongolia. There hasn't been a church in Mongolia until recently, and he's working with their leaders. Amazing. The alternative groups like the LDS and the Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Science and others are warnings that truth boundaries can be crossed, that there is such a thing as inside the Christian family and outside the Christian family. You can stray so far that what you believe is no longer recognizably Christian. It's not the same as the gospel that the apostles preached and that the Bible teaches. So we listen to such people to our harm. And then we need to remember that the Enlightenment is constantly trying to seduce us away from God, constantly trying to say, no, don't believe in God, believe the experts. But, there's nothing beyond this life. Just eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. No. That's not true. That can't be true. And I think we're seeing that more and more, that in the times that we're living in, I think the veil has sort of been lifted as to how wrong experts can be sometimes and how agenda-driven that the ruling class can be sometimes. I'm not saying always, but sometimes. And that they don't really have answers. And that if you follow them, it's not peace, it's division sometimes. Only Christ unites people. Only Christ saves people. Only Christ gives people hope. All right. Coming up next time is our final session, part 6, the global expansion of the church from 1850 to the present day. I think you're going to be very excited, as I am, to go through this period together. See you then.